I filled in the tests, and then it gave me this a report at the end. And I phoned you up to say, Marsha, and you said, "Hi, Ian, what's the problem?" I said, the results tell me that I'm a racist, sexist, misogynistic guy who thinks everybody who hasn't done engineering is a complete idiot." And you laughed at me, okay? And but what was the learning for me in that? Because we've had many conversations since. Because it was implicit association, unconscious. But I took it pretty personally, if you remember.
Yeah, you did. And it was interesting because I was a little bit surprised when you called me up. On the other hand, I was delighted because, you, without even realizing it, you were having a woke moment.
So, welcome to Let's Talk Leadership. I'm joined on this episode by my good friend and colleague, Marsha. And one thing I will tell you about Marsha is she's from the US and she lives just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. But I'm going to let her introduce herself because she has a fun way of doing it around social identity. So, Marsha, thank you so much for joining us. How would you like to introduce yourself today?
Well, hello, Ian, and thanks for this conversation. You and I always have such great conversations, especially when we're working together. And actually, I thought about introducing myself when you first introduced the whole notion of social identity as part of our leadership development program. And what I would do in front of the program with the participants is I would introduce myself using all of my group identities. And so I'm going to do this with the folks who may be listening to this particular episode.
Great.
So, of course, you called me Marsha, and that's my name. But if you could imagine, as I am introducing myself, just imagine these little circles and that identity in that circle. So one of those circles would include the fact that, as you can see, I'm African American, and I am cisgender, and you can't see that, but I'm letting you know. I'm a mother, and not only am I a mother, but I'm the mother of a son who's in his 30s, and he also has Asperger's. So he's known as an ASPE. I am an RN, registered nurse. And as part of that, being a registered nurse, I was in the U.S. Navy. As a matter of fact, I oftentimes tell people I grew up in the Navy. I am an executive coach. I'm an organization development consultant. I've gone to different schools. So I have a graduate degree in organization development, a graduate degree in nursing. I am adjunct faculty.
You had a name, Marsha, sorry to interrupt you. You had a name to describe your childhood because you moved around with your military father.
Yeah.
Was the term you called?
Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, another one of my identities is that I'm an Army brat.
An Army brat, yeah.
An Army brat, yeah. And some people call it military brat. And I'm adjunct faculty at Georgetown University. And so all of these different identities, when I started thinking about it, and as I was introducing myself using all these different identities, I realized that, they all had values. They all had different life experiences. They all had potentially traditions associated with each one of them. So, for example, I'm also a Unitarian Universalist. Which is a religious denomination, which is a strong focus on social justice and social change. So one of the things that we're doing right now here in the United States is, getting ready for the November election. And so as a Unitarian Universalist, with that strong focus on social justice and social change, I've been really, really involved in voting rights, become a strong voting rights advocate. And so as I think about my different identities, and I think about how those identities, depending upon what's going on at any given moment, one identity may pop up. And the reason it pops has to do with the values and the life experiences associated with how that identity, developed in the first place.
And I hope we'll talk about some examples of those pops, because as we talk about your your breadth of experience and some of the stories that you share, as you say, some of these become more significant in at any given moment. Totally almost unpredictable, but they just pop, and we'll share some stories later. So Marsha, you and I got to know each other through some mutual friends, and then we worked together. Haven't done it in the last year or so, unfortunately, but worked in the US. So I would come to the US, we'd fly you into to Michigan, on the outskirts of Detroit, and we worked together with a couple of clients, one in particular. And we started to develop a program of leadership development, which was a bit different, wasn't it? We were focusing on different topics, and we harnessed the power of being in the US, which is a very multicultural society, and based on history, also yourself. And you were triggering us and helping us to embrace inclusion, diversity issues, and we brought that into the classroom. And the first memory I have of our work together was around those topics, was this whole concept of bias, implicit bias or unconscious bias. And you introduced that. And that's very important to you based on your identities you just mentioned. So, and what we did is you encouraged us to fill in some online assessments, the IATs, the implicit association tests. And as I remember, you asked us to fill in, I think I did 3. I did one on gender, one on race, and one on job. I think it was still career. And anyway, just for the viewers, long story short, I filled in the tests, and then it gave me this a report at the end. And I phoned you up to say, Marsha, and you said, "Hi, Ian, what's the problem?" I said, it comes. The results tell me that I'm a racist, sexist, misogynistic guy who thinks everybody who hasn't done engineering is a complete idiot. And you laughed at me, okay? And but what was the learning for me in that? Because we've had many conversations since. Because it was implicit association, unconscious. But I took it pretty personally, if you remember.
Yeah, you did. And it was interesting because I was a little bit surprised when you called me up. On the other hand, I was delighted because, you, without even realizing it, you were having a woke moment.
Yeah, definitely.
And by woke, I mean, you had all of a sudden this test, which is nothing more than, you're sitting down and doing mental associations with one characteristic to another characteristic. So it doesn't really mean that you are a sexist or a racist or a misogynist, It just means that there are certain associations that, come to you when you see certain pairs. However, you had interpreted as that I must be this, and that. However, being able to take that and deconstruct it in terms of why would you even go there? Why would you even go there? And being able to then begin to think about, okay, so maybe if I do make these mental associations on this test, why would it not show up in my everyday behaviors?
And we talked about this, right? Because you said to me, but Ian, if I'm not mistaken, you probably grew up in a mostly white community. Yes. You probably had many male role models, particularly in the field of engineering, which you studied. So it's not unusual, is it, based on your social upbringing, to have the potential for biases, but it doesn't make you necessarily act that way. And then you shared with me your experience when you took the test, because you had a pretty much of an aha moment on the racial bias that you had, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I actually showed a moderate preference for white
people. Yeah.
For whites, and at first I was a little bit taken back until I sat back and again began to think about my own background, my own rearing, as we called it. And I grew up, as I mentioned, one of my identities is that of being an Army brat, which meant that, unlike a lot of African Americans here in the United States who were growing up at the same time I was growing up, who came from very segregated backgrounds, I was in an integrated, very much integrated environment. And by integrated, I'm talking about there were a diversity of people in my environment. However, it wasn't so diverse that I did not know that I was an African American because, it didn't matter if you were African American or Asian. And of course, I don't think that, we even saw any people of indigenous background. If we did not know it. But we recognized that we were in the minority.
Yeah.
We were in the minority. But I still, was growing up in a much more diverse environment than a lot of individuals at the time that I was growing up were growing up in. And even today, to be quite honest with you, we would think that, okay, in the 21st century, that this has changed. It really hasn't. We happen to be, and you've visited us here in Virginia, where we live right outside of Washington, D.C. We're the only Black family on our street. We're the only Black family in our neighborhood. And so this whole notion of diversity, it's one of these things that is aspirational in a lot of cases. And when you and I were developing, and then when we brought this into the classroom, and I have such admiration for you, Ian, because you were right there with me in terms of thinking, okay, yeah, we can do this, because we made the business case for why diversity was so important. And then we went even farther and saying it's not just about having diverse people around you, but it's also about providing a work environment that is inclusive and where equity exists, and how to tap into that as a leader. And there's some research out there that shows that those leaders who can tap into that, and this is why we also emphasize this whole notion of self-awareness, and we had our participants to do the IAT.
We did.
Because that your self-awareness makes you more aware of perhaps your own behaviors, and the need to be very much aware of how your behaviors impact other people. And if you're going to be able to tap into that diversity and to be able to create an environment of inclusivity and equity, then you have to be able to self-manage. You have to know yourself. But that results, if you can do it, and if you can pull it off, you can really benefit. But more importantly, your organization can benefit in terms of financial performance, overall effectiveness, stakeholder satisfaction, and just plain joy in the workplace, which I think that we've forgotten.
Yeah, it's the business case. And one of the sad but very helpful situations we'd often find is we'd run these programs maybe 2 or 3 a year. And every time that you would reset your examples, your stories, you would have a whole list of new examples. But one of the stories that you'd share regularly with the group around bias was your work in Saudi Arabia. And you must tell me again about the time that you arrived and you had all your paperwork, but you were just arriving in the immigration part, weren't you, in Riyadh? Tell me the story again.
Yeah. And what I was trying, the context for the story was that I wanted to emphasize to the participants that bias is not a one-way type of attitude, that we all have biases. And so I have a client in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And so I had heard all of these different stories about Saudi Arabia. And of course, you see different ways that Saudi Arabia, the individuals in Saudi Arabia, the people in Saudi Arabia are depicted on the television. And of course, it wasn't my first time in the Middle East, but I had been in the not as conservative areas like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And I always say the closer you get to Mecca, the more conservative the Middle East becomes. And so, of course, I'm flying into Riyadh, and I had never been to Riyadh. So I had already conjured up in my head that, okay, I'm coming into this very conservative, from a religious perspective, country, but also in terms of how they treat women. So now I have these two thoughts in my head, and I'm walking into the terminal, and all of a sudden, I don't know why, but I became preoccupied about whether or not I have my visa, if all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And so I'm becoming a little bit anxious as I'm getting closer and closer to this gentleman who is sitting there in a very, prime and proper way, no smile at all. And so I approach him and I give him my passport and I give him my visa. And I'm even afraid to smile. I mean, I have this kind of like on my face. And he's looking at my visa and he's looking at my passport. And I'm thinking, oh, please let this visa be okay. I do not feel like making that trip back to the U.S. Without having even set foot in Riyadh. All of a sudden, he looks up and there's this huge smile on his face. So I'm thinking, okay, what's so funny? And I looked behind me because I thought that maybe somebody behind me that he recognized had come up behind me. No one's there. And I said, he goes, you have the personality of Viola Davis. And I looked at him. At this point in time, now you have to remember, I've mentioned that I was already anxious about the visa, and it's my first time coming into Riyadh. And I am thinking, who is Viola Davis? I cannot even remember. And he saw this look on my face that indicated that I was and he goes, you know how to get away from murder. I was totally blown away. I said, pardon me? He goes, you know how to get away with murder. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And I said, you watch How to Get Away with Murder? Now, that right there, as it was coming out of my mouth, it alerted me to the fact that I was already biased. In that, you mean you have a television and they allow you to watch How to Get Away? I mean, that's in essence what was in my conversation. He didn't pick up on it, however, thank goodness, but he did go on to say, now, Oprah, she's okay, and Gayle King, and I realized, I'm probably the first African-American woman this man has ever met. And he has to make meaning of me. He has to put me in a category. And the closest he can come is Viola Davis. And I thought, well, if he has a positive notion of Viola Davis, I will just let it go at that. And so I said, oh, okay. And I said, well, I'm glad that you like her. And he goes, oh, yes, I love Viola Davis. And I'm thinking, okay. And he handed me my passport back and he handed the visa back to me. And as I was walking, I said, I promise not to murder anybody here while I'm in the kingdom. And he laughed, I laughed, and I was off to my consultation.
It's a wonderful story because, again, it's associations and things, but it's also your own inherent bias around the fact, I could have a problem with my visa application, or I could have some issues here with my gender or my race, which reminds me of something else that you said. So we've worked together for a number of years now, and one of the most powerful things you've ever said to me is that there's not a day goes by where you're not reminded of the fact that you're a Black African-American woman. And that really stuck with me because I don't have that same concern when I meet new people. I'm not reminded that I'm a slightly chubby, white, bald-headed guy in leadership development. That's not mentioned anywhere. It's not relevant to it. But of course, this is part of your identity. You've mentioned it already. And you've got examples of stories where that plus being a mother has triggered you. I remember the story when your son was pulled over. Just to share that story with us, because again, it reminds us to think again and slow down our thinking in the way that we have biases.
Yeah, and we you're mentioning sometimes we have bias, and the story that I just shared with you about Saudi Arabia is it's a story. It's one of my life experiences, of course, and it's pretty innocuous. I mean, no one was harmed or hurt. But in the case of racial bias, and of course, that's what we are seeing now that is being protested, via the Black Lives Matter, and not just here in the United States, of course, all over the world.
Yeah.
racial bias is a very different type of bias that can result in harm, and not just harm, but death here in the United States. And of course, the United States has a long history of that. And so and remember I mentioned to you about our identities. As they're associate, we have certain things that that make our identities, the values, the life experiences, the traditions. And of course, one of the traditions associated with being an African American mother or father is that you have what we call the talk. Mm. And the talk has to do with once they have reached a certain age and they are going to be going out, and especially if they're going to be driving, what to do if you're pulled over by the police. And many, the way that the police should be viewed is that they're there to protect you, there to support you. However, because of the reputation of the police here in the United States, and this is not all police, but unfortunately, going back to our biases and the way that we can categorize them, especially as African Americans, the way that we can categorize them because of the harm that they have inflicted upon members of the Black community, they're not oftentimes seen as the people who can help, who can protect. And so as a result, you really and truly have this heart-to-heart conversation with your child about if you're pulled over by a police officer, this is the way that you behave, because you do not want them to think in any way that you are challenging their authority. And so, as could be predicted, my son, when he was 17, he was pulled over. And what happened, the coincidence was that I happened to be there, driving. He was in front of me and the police car was between the two of us, and I was behind the police car, and I happened to be there when he was pulled over. And of course, as a mother, and this is where we're talking about identities popping now, because, the maternal identity popped in terms of, okay, what's going on? Why are they pulling over my son? I mean, I had just been behind him, so I knew he wasn't speeding. And I was like thinking something else must be going on. And so my son, because he had been watching too many of those crazy shows on television about, how you're supposed to, how people react when the police pull them over. Everything that I think I had talked to him about, everything that his father had talked to him about, just went right out of his head. He gets out of the car and goes and sits on the curb. And I'm thinking, what the heck did he just do? In the meantime, I get out of the car and I'm standing there, and there are two cops, one white cop, one white cop. So you can see that they're kind of confused. Here's this kid sitting on the curb, and here's this woman who just is standing by her car. Oh, and by the way, she has a uniform on too, because at that time, one of my identities is that I was a Navy nurse. I wasn't just a nurse, I was a Navy nurse. And so one of my other identities is that I'm a veteran. And so I think they decided, okay, who's going to take whom? And so the black cop takes my son, white cop comes back, and he comes back with kind of this arrogant attitude. And he says to me, who are you? And so I'm a little bit taken back just by the tone of his voice. And I have to admit, Ian, it was like, okay. Then the African-American identity pops. So now he's dealing with two identities. Now he doesn't know this, but he's dealing with the African-American identity, and he's dealing with the mother. And I say to him, I'm his mother. And I think that all of a sudden it dawned on him that, it's kind of like coming in close contact with a grizzly bear. Mm. And you have just been playing with her cub, and she doesn't like it. And so I said, why did you pull my son over? And he couldn't answer. Well, to make a long story short, they walked around the car and they did all of these different things and everything. And finally, they told him that he could go. And so they came back to me, and I said, so why did you stop my car? I stopped my son. And he said, well, they said he had one of the lights out. And so I said, one of the lights. I said, but you were looking all around and under and inside of the car. I said, was there anything else that you were suspecting? No. So I said, well, I tell you what. I said, the car belongs to my husband. It's an ugly old brown van. And so I said, I'll make sure that the light gets fixed. So they get ready to walk away. And I said, no. I said, come back. And so they both turn and they look at me. And I said, we don't live too far from Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., very urban, very Black. And I said, if my son had been in Washington, D.C. and had done what he did in terms of reacting to being pulled over, I said, he probably would be dead. And they both looked, and the Black cop, of course, knew exactly what I was talking about. And I said, would you please go and have a conversation with my son and tell him how to act the next time he's pulled over. I didn't say if he's pulled over. I said when he's pulled over. Mm-hmm. And they did. They went up and they had a really great conversation with him. They came back to me and they actually said thank you. They said, you've made a really good point, and we should have thought about that. And so I said, well, thank you. But that's an everyday occurrence in the United States. And it's not just an everyday occurrence, it occurs everywhere. I mean, a lot of times people think that it's only in the South. But no, it can happen anywhere. I mean, there are famous athletes who have been pulled over. There are actors who have been pulled over. And these are people who have been pulled over because they happen to be driving an expensive car that, the police did not think that they should even own. And it had to do with racial bias.
And it's sad, isn't it, Marsha, because every time that we work together, there'll be a new case, a new story. We discussed some earlier on today that have happened in London recently, and there's always a new case. But the thing that we've been trying to do in the work that we do is to continue a conversation about these topics. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. And I want to thank you for sharing your stories today, because for some people, that's hard to hear. It's hard to listen to, but these are real stories, they're real experiences. And I think the best that we can do is to share these and make sure people are sharing their stories. So I'm going to say we're going to wrap up now, but I would love to have a part 2 at some point as we have some other topics. There's lots more that we can share. We've done much other work around, the power of what you call the 21st century leadership around resiliency and well-being and mindfulness. But I think the big key thing that I discovered and learned and was reminded of working with you is that we have to slow down our thinking. The only way to treat, whether it be gender, race, any form of bias, to maintain more inclusion and embrace more diversity is to just challenge our assumptions and slow our thinking down. And I know that's something that you've been reading a lot about recently as well. So I hope we can come back and talk to you again.
Yeah, I really would love to talk about that because I bring it into my executive coaching. I think that especially in these days, these really trying times, any adaptive leader is really going to have to build that resilience to be able to engage and to stay with what you just said a few minutes ago, and that's that discomfort. And if you're not experiencing any discomfort, you're probably not learning.
Yeah.
And so once you start feeling uncomfortable, just hopefully the light bulb's going to go off and you're going to say, yikes, I am learning. I don't know what I may be learning right now, but I am learning.
Yeah, so keep listening, stay curious. And Marsha, it's been a real pleasure. Let's do this again for our viewers and our listeners in the near future. But that's been Let's Talk Leadership with Marsha. Thank you so much. Love to Shelby and Bob, and stay safe in Washington. Take care.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.